So my car had a random misfire for a while now, and I thought it was just the O2 sensor because it was just a generic one, like an ISR one. So I got a OEM O2 sensor and I replaced it, and the misfire was still there. So I started going down the rabbit hole of taking things apart to try to figure out what was causing it. In hindsight, I should have been recording all of this, but it was just like in the moment, and I thought it was going to be a simple thing to fix, and it wasn't. I basically ended up taking the intake manifold off, trying to find boost leaks, and that's where I noticed that my fuel rail for my injectors was crooked, and it was a vacuum leak coming out of the insulators because the fuel rail was bent. That's where I took everything apart and I pulled the injectors out, and I noticed that the injectors were all torn and the nozzles on them were broken, so I sent them out to get rebuilt and cleaned. And that's where they did a flow test and figured out that one of them was kind of weak before. Thankfully they're all good now, and then I went to go put it all back together and I figured out my fuel rail itself was bent and that the fuel rail is discontinued now. So I had to hunt one down, and I did find a brand new one somehow. And yeah. So what's supposed to be a simple O2 sensor change turned out to be all of this. What ended up happening is I pulled the upper manifold out to get to the fuel rail over here. And then once I pulled the fuel rail out, I saw that the insulators here were all torn and that everything was pretty much just messed up. Obviously I had to pull the throttle body out and just push it to the side. One thing I do that I don't see a lot of people doing is I like to cap everything if I know it's going to be sitting for a while. This is just like one of those little things, and you can see it does work pretty good because all that dirt did not fall into the engine. And if these caps weren't here, you could have something fall in and destroy your motor. I also put one here on the intercooler pipe that you guys can't really see, and then on the intake too. But that's kind of off tracking. So going down the rabbit hole, the first thing I did was pull the upper manifold off because I was looking initially for a boost leak. And the first thing I noticed was this used to be over here with this hose, and there was a cap at this end because I wasn't using this port. The cap was all torn up and this hose was pretty beat up, so what I ended up doing was knocking this off and capping it over here so it has less points to fail. And then after I passed the upper manifold, I took a look at the fuel rail and I noticed that it wasn't sitting perfectly like straight, and that was because these insulators over here that the fuel rail goes into like that in the manifold, you can see are all torn. So it was leaking pretty bad out of those, and I got new ones of those. Here's a part number if anyone needs it. And then I started digging deeper because I started wondering why the fuel rail was crooked. And then I realized that the insulators for the bolts were all torn, or like just sandwiched when they should be like that. So I got new ones of those. Here's a part number if anyone needs it. And these pretty much just go where the bolts are on the fuel rail to space it up. And since they were flat like this, they were crooked and causing everything to not seal properly. And then once I looked at that and I got new insulators, I put the fuel rail on, and then I noticed that the fuel rail itself was bent. I guess from being crooked for so long it just warped. So I had to hunt down another fuel rail, which is pretty difficult because they've been discontinued for a long time. Thankfully, I did find one, and a person hooked me up who had it for a while. And then continuing going down the rabbit hole, one thing that bothered me was I had a cheap ISR adapter for the fuel pressure regulator, and I have a Tomei fuel pressure regulator, so I picked up a Tomei adapter. And then getting to the injectors, when I pulled the injectors out, I noticed that these nozzles were disintegrated, the screens were torn, and they just looked like clapped. So what I did was I ended up sending them to Mr. Injector to get rebuilt because I had a feeling they were just like really far gone. And you can see from his test that the before, each injector had a different flow rating of 95, 92, 96, and 93, which is very inconsistent and can like lead to a slight misfire. Now they're all even at 98 and all refreshed. What I actually wanted to do before sending these out was just re-screen them and put new nozzles, which you can get. But then I thought about it and I realized that the injectors are like more than 25 years old and they're probably like all gummed up, so they should be cleaned. And I did plan on using OEM O-rings, which if anyone needs the part numbers, here's the part number for the small ones and here's a part number for the big ones. But thankfully when the injectors got rebuilt, he re-O-ringed them. And the last thing is the caps for the injectors. One of them was completely stripped, so I had to grind out notches to get them unscrewed, and I had to get 2 new screws. If anyone needs a part number, again, here you go. And then I just got a new gasket for the throttle body and a new gasket for the upper to lower manifold, because I did copper spray this, and because of that it did get pretty beat up. You can't really reuse a gasket if you copper spray it, but it does help it seal a little better. And then I got copper spray. So I did want to show this a little closer so you guys get a better understanding. These are the insulators that connect the fuel rail to the lower manifold, and you can see my insulators were pretty clapped and leaking vacuum through them. These would go on the ports just like that, and then the fuel rail would sit on like that. But because these were torn, they were leaking vacuum. And then the small insulators will go on these ports right here on the manifold and mount to here. And because mine were sandwiched, it was causing the fuel rail to twist this way, and it was causing vacuum leaks from the top. What I ended up realizing is because it was twisted, I guess, for so long, this fuel rail got bent. I'm not sure if you guys could see it, but it is kind of like a arch right here, which was causing a bunch of leaks. And thankfully the new fuel rail is pretty straight and it should solve all those leaks. The reason I went down this rabbit hole is because I did a smoke test on my car and a boost pressure test and found that I had a bunch of vacuum leaks and boost leaks. So I just kept digging deeper and deeper trying to fix them all. Once I have everything back together, I am going to show you guys how to do a boost leak test using a compressor and also a smoke test using a smoke tester. Each method does do the same thing, but in different ways, and they both have their own pros and cons, so I do want to show how to do both. But to do that, we need to put everything back together. And what I'm going to be starting with is attaching the fuel system back together on the car. So I'm going to take the new fuel rail, attach the Tomei adapter onto it, and then after that I'm going to mount this onto the lower manifold using the new insulators. And once that's all mounted, I'm going to take the injectors that I just got back from getting serviced, and I'm going to lube the O-rings and pop them onto the fuel rail like that. And once that's all back together, I'm going to take the caps and put them on top. But with these two, I'm going to replace the screws. And then after that, we could attach everything else and continue on to testing. So on the very first step, we already ran into a problem. If you look at the Tomei adapter compared to this cheap ISR one, it's quite a bit thicker, and because of that, the factory screws are too short for the Tomei one. So I'm just gonna run the ISR one using the gas or the O-ring that came with the Tomei one and put it back on this fuel rail. But everything else should be pretty straightforward. Now that we got all the fuel stuff back together, I got the fuel rail on, the injectors in, the lines connected. What I'm gonna do now is put the fuse back in for the fuel pump and crank the key a few times to build fuel pressure to look for leaks. I'm also going to be looking for leaks in the fuel pump area, because one thing I did off camera is I put a stainless steel zip tie on the fuel float. And the reason I did that is because anyone with like a S14 knows this problem. If you drift them, the fuel float pops off no matter what, and then your gas gauge is very inaccurate. One solution I came up with is using a stainless steel zip tie around the fuel float in the fuel tank. And what that does is hold it in place, so when you are cornering hard or anything, the fuel flow won't pop off. I kind of wish I recorded that, but I know a lot of my friends have S14, so I'll show it in the future. Basically all I did was grab a stainless steel zip tie and wrap it around the float on the hook and tie it together. And the reason you want to use a stainless steel zip tie rather than like a normal zip tie is because a normal one could deteriorate, and stainless steel is not going to corrode in a gas tank with gas, unlike other metals. So we confirmed we have no leaks on the injector side, the lines, and the fuel pump in the back. So now what we're going to be doing is attaching the upper manifold back on. Before we do that, we're going to take some rubbing alcohol and clean the surfaces on the lower manifold and the upper manifold. Then we're going to take the new gasket and copper spray it and place it on, and then just mount it up. So now I'm going to be taking these caps off. Everything buttoned up on the manifold side. All I have to do now is attach the intercooler pipes and tighten a bunch of clamps that I had loosened because I did polish all the pipes, and we should be good. Then we're just going to pressure test it, make sure there's no leaks, smoke test it also, and hopefully we're good. So I got everything put together. I got all the intercooler pipes on and tightened them, and then I actually started the car. The reason I started the car and made sure it idled is because if you do have a major boost leak, like a coupler is off or something, the car won't idle and you don't really need to do a boost leak test or a smoke test to figure that out. And rather than wasting time doing that, I wanted to make sure that all the major components were on so we can start finding smaller leaks, which is what these tests are used for. What I'm going to be starting with is a smoke test, and to do that I'm going to take the intake off, because that's where I'm going to be feeding the smoke in using this cup. This cup comes with the Autoline, or actually it doesn't. You have to buy this cup separate if you're using an Autoline smoke tester. And the reason I'm using an Autoline smoke tester is because it was just the one recommended by Amazon. If you have any open ports in your car, you want to cap them using these caps. These are the same caps I used to cap the intake manifold earlier, and they're just good for capping ports that you need to fill in so smoke doesn't bleed out while you're doing the smoke test. The other thing you want to do is get your smoke fluid and fill the canister up to the full line. I'll show that in a little bit when we start. And the last thing you want to do is make sure you have a battery tender. The reason you want to have a battery tender is because the smoke tester runs off the battery with the car off. So if you are doing this for a while, you don't want to run the battery dead. And yeah, so you want to have a battery tender on the car and then just hook up the smoke tester, which is what I'm doing now, and we'll get started. So normally with the smoke tester, you only get this smaller tip, which you're supposed to put into like a vacuum port. I opted to get this additional cone because I like to put it in the intake. So all you have to do is put this onto the vacuum port adapter, and then you could put this into the intake like this. One thing I also forgot to mention is my smoke tester has a built-in compressor. There is a lower model that you have to attach air into it. If you have that one, you just need to connect the air fitting, but I opted to get the one that has the built-in compressor because I just liked how it was like a little simpler. And then all you have to do to turn it on is, you'll notice on the switch here, it says heat aux and heat only. Before you turn the smoke tester on, you actually have to heat up the canister for like 3 to 5 minutes. So you want to switch it to heat only, which is right there, and leave it for 3 minutes, and then you can start the smoke test. So the smoke tester is heated up now. The way I know that is because it's hot to the touch. I actually go based off of feel rather than time, because sometimes it does take longer to warm up than other times. So now what we're gonna do is switch the switch from heat only to heat and aux, which will turn on the built-in compressor. And then smoke should start coming out of this cone, feeding it throughout the engine. What we're going to be doing now is looking at all of the mating surfaces for like the couplers and the injectors and everything, and looking for smoke. This is also how I found the vacuum and boost leaks before, because I did see smoke coming out from the injectors. So you just have to keep a close eye and look for smoke. Oh, and if you were to look, you could see smoke is coming out of the cone, and it will be feeding throughout the engine bay. So I had the smoke test go on for about 5 minutes and no smoke came out from the system. Another thing you want to look out for is the smell of smoke, because sometimes you can't see it but you can smell it. But it seems like this system is pretty sealed up as like I expected, because I did just re-gasket everything. But it is reassuring to see that everything is good in terms of the smoke test. So now what we're going to be doing is like moving our way to the boost leak test using a compressor. And the reason we're going to use a compressor is because it actually creates more pressure than a smoke test, which can show boost leaks that come up at higher PSIs. To do this, you do need a compressor and a tire inflator, and then also you do need some type of cap. A lot of people like to use PVC caps and put a wheel valve stem. For me, this is a purple power cap with the wheel valve stem, and it actually turned out to be the perfect size for a SR intake. So you just have to put it into the intake like this. And then put the clamp on, tighten it down, and then you can start feeding air. So you can see already, we already found a leak where the intake meets the turbo. If I were to move the coupler, you could already hear air leaking out. So I probably just need to adjust this coupler and tighten it down. But you can already see how this is more useful than a smoke test. So this gauge isn't completely accurate. I'm pretty sure I have more than 10 pounds in the system, and there are no leaks throughout the system, so it is pretty much sealed. So now we know that everything is good. So now that we finished boost leak testing and vacuum testing this car and confirmed that there are no major leaks, we know that the car should be running a lot better, because it did have major leaks before that we fixed. So it is reassuring to see that everything is like fixed now. Hopefully you guys take something away from this video. If you guys do have an old SR, I do highly recommend you boost leak testing and smoke testing it, because I guarantee there are a few leaks that you may not know about that are there, making it not run perfectly. But yeah, thanks for watching.